Welcome back to the last attachment style we are discussing, which is about 5% of the population. It's called the Fearful Avoidant or the Disorganized Attachment style. And the terms are used interchangeably, but the way I kind of create this in my mind is that disorganized attachment style is more for what we saw in childhood, for those infants who ran to mom and then froze and they had this very disorganized reaction. Why? Because they have no organized way of getting their needs met in a relationship. But at the adult romantic level, a lot of times we're calling it fearful avoidant. Why? Because they're afraid of that relationship. They're afraid pretty much of, in my opinion, the world. But we're afraid of relationships. This is my style. I am working to try to earn my secure attachment style, but that is difficult because this attachment style has kept me very protected throughout my life. So letting go of it means that I'm also letting go of the protections that have kept me safe my entire life and trying to choose new protections. So it's actually very difficult. Now, as I said, it's about 5% of the population, and there's a reason for that. It's because of how this blueprint was created. So let's take a moment and take a look at the blueprint for the fearful avoidant or the disorganized attachment style. For the fearful avoidant or disorganized attacher, their childhood looked a little bit different than the other three attachment styles. In fact, it was so different that they sustained a lot of trauma. Reason why is that their caregiver, the person that they were supposed to be able to depend on for safety, security, support, was also the very source of their fear. Now, this could have come from things like abuse or neglect, parental substance abuse, or parental mental health disorders, maybe parental incarceration or abandonment issues. There could be a lot of reasons why this trauma was created, but ultimately what this child learned was that safety and fear were completely intertwined. I need this person, this parent, this caregiver for my survival, but this is also the same person that might legitimately kill me. So when these children grow up in that environment, they're not sure what to do. They don't know what safety really looks like. And so when I originally created my two groups, my players, my runners, and my clingers and puppies, I eventually learned that there was this third group, the confused squirrels, people like me, who, like a confused squirrel in the middle of the road who's constantly searching for safety and doesn't know where safety is. That's what the world is like for individuals with fearful avoidance. We're looking for safety. We want that safety and security, but at the same time, every relationship has some level of fear to it because that's the environment that we grew up in. That searching for that safety and security was also combined with fear. So this was a difficult childhood. It was eventful. It was interesting to say the least. However, when we see this develop into that blueprint, that working model of self and others, it's different than the others. That working model of self is I'm not lovable and I can't get my needs met in relationship. That working model of others is that others are not trustworthy and they're not going to be there when I need them to be. So you can understand how walking around the world with that kind of working model, that other people aren't safe, but it's also me, that's going to create a lot of insecurity and a lot of essentially instability. And that is going to absolutely show up in their romantic relationships. And until there's a moment where all of this kind of converges, there's a catalyst to kind of help you understand that this is something that needs to be repaired internally, you may not ever recognize it. You might just go on thinking that this is everybody, this is the world that you live in, this is normal, this is how you're going to survive, without ever realizing that there's a way to internally change that. The dance of the fearful avoidant is also going to look very different than the other attachment styles. So for these individuals, what I find so interesting is that they have both the anxious and the avoidant side. And if you ever get an opportunity to hear Janina Fisher speak, she's one of our leading people in trauma and psychological and emotional trauma. Her trauma workshops are absolutely amazing, and she discusses what she calls traumatic attachment, which is what we would call a fearful avoidant or disorganized attachment style. And one of the things she says is that there's two flavors of these individuals. And she's right. A lot of people will say that a fearful avoidant can lean anxious or lean avoidant. And that's usually where they kind of spend most of their time. For example, I'm a fearful avoidant, but I lean avoidant. I actually spend more of my time in my avoidant space than I do my anxious space. In fact, I hate my anxious space, and I try to avoid that. So when we talk about fearful avoidant or disorganized attachment, really the trick is to remember that disorganized component, no organized way of meeting their needs inside of a relationship. So they're going to have a very wide range of behaviors. So one of the best examples that I heard was that when you think about attachment styles, kind of picture it on a football field. An avoidant might be from one end zone to the 50-yard line. The anxious might be from the 50-yard line to the other end zone. The secure is going to kind of hang out right there in the middle at the 50. But for the fearful avoidant or the disorganized attachment, they run the whole field. We've got all of the different options available to us, and we use them. And the best way to explain it is that depending on what trigger has been hit will determine what protection is actually showing up for that person to use to try to kind of feel safe again. So when we look at this dance that they're going to have in a relationship, it's a very low need for closeness. It's a very low need for dependence, but a very high relationship anxiety. And one of the differences that I saw that was very interesting is I used to just always thought that I had abandonment issues, and I would easily tell partners that I have abandonment issues. But over time, as a result of researching this and studying all of it, I realized there's actually a subtle difference in the abandonment issues of a fearful avoidant versus the abandonment issues of an anxious preoccupied. An anxious preoccupied is going to have some subtle language differences, such as, I don't know how I'm going to be able to live without my partner. Like, if my partner dumps me, I don't know what I'm going to do. Whereas I find with myself and other fearful avoidants that I've met, that's not the same language that's used. The language is more subtly different in the sense of, what happens if they hurt me? What happens if they cheat on me? What happens if they lie to me? It's more about betrayal. Even though it comes out as abandonment, it's actually more about betrayal than it is the genuine abandonment that I've seen with anxious preoccupieds. So even though they both might come out saying it's abandonment issues, for the fearful avoidance, it seems to be more rooted in betrayal, and that betrayal of safety, security, and stability. Whereas the anxious preoccupied, it's, if you leave me, what does that say about me? Like, I'm not good enough. So just a subtle difference between the two. But for these individuals on that revised adult attachment scale by Collins and Reed that I actually like the most, again, it's going to be low closeness and dependency scores with a high anxiety score. And that anxiety is caused by a different root fear than that of the anxious preoccupied. Fearful relationships are interesting to say the least. When it comes to fearful avoidant relationships, again, please remember that they have both the anxious and the avoidant side, and depending on what trigger is activated is what protection you will see. So these individuals can hyperactivate and cling to their partners. They can also deactivate, emotionally suppress, and withdraw from their partners. So you're going to see a wide range of behaviors in these relationships. Now, for me personally, 25% of my relationships seem to have been with fearful avoidance. They're definitely interesting people. I think I'm kind of interesting at times myself, not all the time, but sometimes. Ultimately, I've just also admitted that I don't think I've actually ever been in a relationship with someone who is genuinely a secure, attached person. So that's kind of an interesting fact about myself. So, coming from a fearful avoidant, again, if you don't know what safety is supposed to look like, how do you know what you're looking for? You're going to go through and find relationships that probably feel familiar, but that could be repeating a childhood pattern that's not necessarily healthy for you. So then that's where we're going to see some of these relationship behaviors actually popping up. So again, just like the dismissive avoidant, and even at times with the anxious preoccupied, you're going to see communication difficulties. Not only are we not always able to identify our needs within a relationship, but we can't always even communicate those needs. I know that there are times when I have tried to communicate in relationships, I've tried to be vulnerable, I've tried to talk about things. I open my mouth and literally squeak. Nothing comes out because I'm just frozen in that moment. And even though I may want to talk about what's going on for me, literally cannot. Now I've learned that that's an indication that I'm supposed to go regulate my nervous system and then come back to that conversation. But a couple years ago, I certainly didn't know that. Another thing you might see is the conflict avoidance, or you could see that hyperactivation and kind of an argument come from it. It's going to kind of depend, again, on what the trigger was. So if they are avoiding the conflict, it might be coming from I don't want to create a problem where my partner might leave me. Or if they are hyperactivating, it might be more like a protest behavior because they've felt some distance in the relationship and they're trying to actually get your attention to come back into this relationship. Again, repair challenges are definitely going to be a concern because, again, if you weren't modeled how to repair a relationship when there was a problem, how are you going to be able to have those skills until someone teaches them to you and your nervous system feels safe enough to take that information in and actually go ahead and apply it? So you're still going to probably see some repair challenges for these individuals. The horsemen are absolutely possible. You might see that criticism coming up because maybe that's a protest behavior, or you might see that stonewalling coming up because they're just deactivated and shut down. You could absolutely see a wide range of behaviors there as well. So we're going to struggle with self-regulation and co-regulation. Again, not skills we were taught in childhood or even in our early lives. We have to learn those skills. We actually need someone to teach them to us, but our nervous system has to be calm enough to let that information in. So you have to be able to have some feeling of safety and security to be able to learn how to self-regulate, how to co-regulate. And again, Janina Fisher does an excellent job at explaining what she calls the window of tolerance, which is, basically like how much, I guess you could say, how much discomfort can you tolerate? If your ability to tolerate is very small, well, you got to stretch it out a little at a time, and that's going to be difficult. It's going to take a little bit of a longer process to probably get through that part. But in order to be able to get these regulation skills down, to learn these skills, we're going to have to be able to make sure that your nervous system can handle some level of discomfort and gradually push that boundary a little bit further each time. You could definitely see discords with these individuals, and you're likely going to see the push-pull. So every time I've heard the push-pull talked about, it's always an external behavior, like a make-up-breakup cycle. They push their partner away, they pull their partner closer, they confuse their partners. What I don't see a lot of people talking about is the internal struggle that can go on for a fearful avoidant. So one of the experiences that I had is this gentleman had popped up on my radar and had taken an interest in me, and there was some encouragement for the two of us to pursue this. Everything in my body, of course, is going to scream danger about getting into a potential new relationship. So I absolutely wanted to cut bait and run. But at the same time, I really actually very much liked him and wanted to see if we could have this relationship. So getting stuck in this push-pull back and forth was all internal for me. I absolutely wanted to get close, but at the same time, there were little things that he would say or do that would definitely trigger me and kind of scare me. There were some inaccuracies in his story, which is not uncommon at the beginning of the relationship, but inaccuracies or dishonest statements. A lot of people kind of stretch the truth a little at the beginning of a relationship, but little things like that I will pick up on, and they are huge danger cues for me. So then I want to run. But at the same time, I wanted to get to know this individual. And for the longest time, when people asked, said, well, let's not get too excited. We'll see how this goes. We'll see. And I had even joked about at one point of putting him into my phone as we'll see, because I really did want that connection, but I really was scared at the same time. So the push-pull is not always an external. It can be an internal. It could be something that you're just battling it out in your own head. And again, Janina Fisher and IFS does such a great job at explaining why we can see this internal conflict within ourselves, because one part of me wants this, the other part of me wants that. And trying to isolate out those parts and figure out what they're doing in our brain and how they're interacting with each other can be complicated, but very necessary to be able to get to a final resolution. Now, what does the external push-pull behavior look like? Well, one of the gentlemen that I dated a long time ago, he even told me in the very beginning of our relationship that he loved the push-pull. He enjoyed the arguments with his girlfriends. And I was like, listen, that's not me. Like, I'm not likely to pick a fight over nothing. You're probably not going to get that from me. But he liked that push-pull. And basically, now looking back, he was basically telling me he was a fearful avoidant from the very beginning, and I just didn't know that. He also loved the movie The Notebook, and I watched it with him. That was an experience. But ultimately, you see these scenes in this movie where the female character is pushing the male character away, and then she's pulling him in, and then she's pushing him away, and she's pulling him in. And in real life, what have I seen from my friends? Well, to be perfectly honest, I see a makeup breakup cycle. So the one fearful avoidant that I had dated years ago, that we were great together, it was a lot of fun, but in his past relationships, and I had known him for a very, very long time, so I had seen this pattern go on, and he even said I recircled my girlfriends. And it was true. He would break up and discard them, and then, get with somebody new, and then discard them and get back together with the one he was with, and he would just kind of jump around from all these ex-girlfriends, and they were constantly on a rotation. And sadly, I was one of them as well. We had a relationship, I had gotten discarded, and then we had a very brief relationship, I had gotten discarded again, and then we had another relationship and ended up in a discard. So again, that push-pull is definitely seen. Another friend of mine broke up with their significant other, wanted to get back together because they realized soon after that this was not what they wanted. And I said, please give it a little bit more time, because both of you and your nervous systems are just absolutely raw. You need a little time to heal before you guys get back together, or otherwise you're going to repeat the same thing. They got back together too soon. Their nervous systems had not calmed down, and there was another breakup. And then a few weeks later, they were back together. And then a few months later, they were broken up again. And the repair efforts were not going well, and basically they just kept re-triggering themselves. So you can absolutely see that push-pull behavior. It can be external, it can be internal. So if you are with somebody that you think is a fearful avoidant, and you feel like this could be an open conversation, it might be very challenging for the FA to actually have that conversation. It might be worth, if they're willing to approach it, discussing what this looks like for them, because what is that desire for closeness and connection actually looking like, and what's the fear that's holding them back, and kind of maybe find that core fear. That's probably better done for a therapist, but if you get to that point, you can actually give it a try. Switching your attachment style from a fearful, avoidant, or disorganized attachment style to earn your secure has an added layer to it that the other insecure styles, like the dismissive, avoidant, or the anxious, preoccupied, don't have. And that is the fact that this attachment style is rooted in trauma. So we need to work with that trauma and start trying to heal that trauma in order to also start shifting the attachment style. Now, Janina Fisher is one of the experts on trauma, and she does some amazing lectures explaining all of this. She has resources for clients and for therapists, from even the most minor effects of trauma to the most significant effects of trauma. And she just does an excellent job at explaining how we can work with trauma. That does not mean reliving the original trauma. That does not mean having to retell a story that could potentially re-traumatize you. What it does mean is understanding how the triggers that are showing up today and the protections that you're using to deal with those triggers in this present moment are leftover memories from a traumatic experience, and how we can go ahead and increase our tolerance to that discomfort, regulate our nervous system, use our neurobiology to be able to create new experiences that are healing and restorative, rather than living with all these trauma responses. And I'm not saying it's going to be easy, but I am saying it's going to be worth it. And 90% of what I do in real life, I tell people, like, nothing I ever tell you is going to be easy. It's going to be worth it. And to me, that's better, because if you're given the choice, why would you choose something that's easy when you can choose something legendary? Healing from trauma, to me, is legendary because it takes an immense amount of emotional inner strength to be able to do this. And that is something that I think trauma survivors have, is an immense amount of inner strength to have been able to have survived things that a lot of people wouldn't be able to survive. And they've survived it. So you have this strength already in you to be able to start healing that trauma. And then as a result of starting to work and heal that trauma, you're going to probably start shifting your attachment style. So some things to work on, some goals to start with. First of all is obviously connecting with your emotions. Just like the dismissive avoidant, we do have that emotional suppression skill. And it works well for certain things, like, for example, my job as a paramedic. That emotional suppression skill is golden to have. Does not always work in the long term, but in that moment, to be able to get through that emergency, it's nice to have. But at the same time, you still need to be able to connect with your emotions at a later point in time to be able to process and regulate. So if you're struggling with this, again, I recommend the feelings wheel to kind of help get you started. Another big thing is recognizing safety. If you didn't have safety in childhood, you may not know what that looks like in adulthood. So understanding when you're choosing a situation because it's familiar versus it's genuinely safe, you have to learn what safety actually looks like. So this is probably where a therapist is really going to come and be a big help, because we can start teaching you and helping you understand what safety genuinely looks like. You're also probably going to need to reassess your relationships. Not everyone's meant to move on to the next chapter of your life, and yes, that can bring a lot of grief and sadness with it. But chances are, if you've been picking your relationships based on familiarity versus safety, we might need to reassess those relationships to see if they're really a good idea to bring into the next chapter of your life. Resolving past traumas, as I said, this attachment style is rooted in trauma. We're going to need to work with that trauma as well. And working with the trauma doesn't mean reliving the past. It means working with the present that's actually going on and recognizing that this is a past memory that's coming up in your body. Self-compassion, like I said, I'm working on that now. It's definitely a struggle. I battle it out with my therapist every time she brings it up, to be self-compassionate, because it is not a skill that I have. It is a skill that I am learning. Practicing genuine listening. Remember, if our brains, the FA's brain, is wired to be hypervigilant to detect danger at every little thing, and like I said, I had a partner, absolutely was interested in him, one of the best relationships I've been in, but even little things can definitely trigger me, and then I'm not always listening clearly. So learning to genuinely listen, to understand versus listening to defend, is a critical skill that's going to be needed. And once you're triggered, you're probably going to be listening to defend to find those little inaccuracies, those danger cues, and assess for safety. Acknowledging unresolved emotions is going to be another part. there's probably some leftover emotions. There's probably a lot of leftover emotions from things that have been accumulated over the years from past traumas. We're going to have to kind of get through some of that, but that's going to depend on your ability to be able to identify those emotions to begin with. Also, working on emotional regulation skills may not have been a skill that was developed in childhood. That ability to regulate your nervous system and keep it calm and get you out of that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response and back into your logical brain is going to be a necessary skill. And Janina Fisher explains this beautifully when she talks about how the second our emotional brain, the amygdala, the hippocampus, all of those parts are queued up for danger, it shuts off the prefrontal cortex from that logical thinking part of the brain. So we need to be able to emotionally regulate to calm that emotional brain so that we can get back into our logical brain and approach conflict and resolve conflict and repair and do all of these good things. The other part of it is recognizing inconsistency. Again, as kids, we didn't have the best models growing up of what healthy relationships look like. So we may not understand in the beginning what inconsistency versus consistency actually looks like because it wasn't modeled for us and it wasn't given to us. It's just something we have to learn as adults. So this is probably going to be a skill that you're going to work on with your therapist, but it's definitely a goal that you can set to be able to understand the differences between consistency and inconsistency. As we're wrapping up, just a few final things about the fearful avoidant attachment style. Janina Fisher puts it beautifully that there are two flavors of traumatic attachment. And I've heard a lot of other people say that you can, if you have a fearful avoidant or a disorganized attachment style, you can lean anxious or lean avoidant. Personally, I live in my avoidance space and I hate being in my anxious space. In fact, I try to avoid my relationship anxiety at all costs because I can't stand being in my anxious space. But with that in mind, please remember that a lot of the attachment behaviors that we see are very predictable, and that's the reason why Mary Ainsworth was able to conduct that strange situation test and have the results come out, because the behaviors were very predictable, because the secure, the anxious preoccupied, the dismissive avoidant had organized way of getting their needs met in a relationship, whereas the fearful avoidant or the disorganized attachment style does not have an organized way of getting their needs met in a relationship. So that's why they appear to be so unpredictable. And we can have these two subgroups of the ones that lean anxious or the ones that lean avoidant. And just a little bit of background, when I was selecting assessment methods to use for my research study, I asked a whole bunch of my friends to participate and give me their opinions on different types of assessment methods. And the one that I got the most favorable results that I liked, that my friends liked, was the Revised Adult Attachment Scale. But all this does was tell me that they were a fearful avoidant, opposed to which type they might have been. And so then when I was able to talk to them and kind of look at the bigger picture, it was very interesting. Some of these individuals were showing up as anxious or avoidant in their behavioral patterns, but then the scores on the test were showing otherwise, so I was able to dig a little bit deeper. And so you can actually see that there is a difference between these two groups. Now, like I said, 25% of my past partners have been fearful avoidants, and I've had a bunch of friends who have been fearful avoidants. And again, I see the same thing. Their behavior shows up as kind of one of those two groups until the right trigger has been activated, and then you can see the other side. And it gets a little confusing because you're like, well, I thought they were a runner, but now they're acting like a clinger. Like, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Now it makes a little bit more sense because one of those two sides, the anxious or the avoidant side, might be more visible, might be more dominant, or might be more present until something else happens. So a little bit of information about the fearful avoidant disorganized attachment style that kind of wraps up our discussion on the actual different types of attachment styles before we get into how we can utilize this knowledge when it comes to relationships.